So I'm Gemma, I'm from Newcastle University, and I'm going to talk about some work that we did earlier this year. Next slide, please. So we were asked by NHS England to undertake a rapid review of evidence about measuring frailty in younger populations. And this work came about because there was interest in whether some younger populations could benefit from being classed as frail in order to shape their care. But because frailty is typically assessed in older populations, this presented some questions around how is frailty measured in younger groups, and are there any validated tools to do this? And also, is there any evidence about whether assessing frailty in younger populations actually has any impact on patient care and outcomes? So we undertook a rapid review to answer these questions, which we started in January. And then a bit later in March, when the pandemic began to kick off, we were then asked to do a rapid response piece of work that was embedded within this review. And this was to look for evidence specifically about using the clinical frailty scale with younger populations in critical care settings. Next slide, please. So I'm going to summarise the main findings from this work. I'm not going to detail the methods here, but a key point to note is that we defined younger populations as those aged under 60 years. Next slide, please. So first, we didn't find any measures that were designed and validated to measure frailty specifically in younger populations. The evidence that we found came from studies that were measuring frailty in samples aged under and over 60 years, and using the sorts of tools typically used with older populations. We also found evidence that some measures of frailty demonstrated predictive validity in samples that included younger populations. However, we do need to be cautious about interpreting this evidence. It's unclear to what extent these measures are actually valid across the whole adult age spectrum. And this is because most studies didn't stratify their analyses by age, and most of the studies were using samples that were aged on average over 40 years. We also need to be cautious about interpreting this evidence because studies were using samples aged over and under 60 years. So although there was evidence of predictive validity, we don't know to what extent this was driven by potentially greater prevalence of frailty in the older sample participants. So yes, some measures did demonstrate predictive validity in samples that included those younger populations, but we just need to be careful about how we interpret this. And finally, we found no evidence about the impact of assessing and measuring frailty in younger groups. There was some speculation in some studies about how assessing frailty could benefit patient care, but we didn't find any studies that actually evaluated this. Next slide. In terms of the rapid response work, we found a systematic review published in 2019 and 7 primary studies that looked at the use of the clinical frailty scale in younger populations within critical care and intensive care settings. The systematic review concluded that although the clinical frailty scale is widely used in critical care settings, there's limited evidence about its reliability. We also found mixed evidence across the primary studies about whether the clinical frailty scale could predict ICU and post-discharge death. And there was no evidence about the use of the clinical frailty scale as a triage tool in younger populations. Next slide, please. So to pull this together, there are 2 key takeaways from this work. First, although there is interest, clinical interest in particular, in assessing frailty in younger populations, we do need more evidence about the validity of measures to do this. And we also need evidence about the impact and utility of doing this. The second key takeaway is more of a conceptual question. Is frailty the same in younger and older populations, and therefore can you measure it using the same sorts of tools? This isn't something that we could answer here, but if policy does wish to pursue extending frailty assessment to younger populations, then this is a really important question to explore. So I'll leave it there. I'm happy to answer any questions. If you are interested in knowing more about this work, the full report is published.